So good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to first thank the PHA for inviting me to share this talk. My name is Eka Lorenzo. I'm a general internist and I use the functional medicine framework in my practice. I'm also the medical director of Sinovate, which is the naturals division of Unilab. This afternoon, for my talk, I want to share these points very quickly, the roles of the endothelium and endothelial dysfunction, and very quickly because you, as cardiologists, know this much more than I do. And then I want to focus on the nutritional approaches we can take to enhance endothelial health, particularly more than just the theoretical. I want to be able to share tips or practical approaches that you can share with your patients so that they can apply these nutritional guides to their everyday life. So the endothelium is this very thin lining of cells that forms the interface between the lumen of the blood vessels and the vascular smooth muscle. And these endothelial cells are involved in many different tasks, including the regulation of the equilibrium between hemostasis, thrombosis, and fibrinolysis. These endothelial cells also form the semi-permeable barrier between the blood and the surrounding tissues. So they control the transfer of solutes and macromolecules into and out of the blood, so across that blood vessel wall. They're involved in leukocyte trafficking, and the interaction between the white blood cells and the endothelial cells actually contribute to the immune response and to wound repair, including acute and chronic inflammation. Now, they're also involved in the production or the creation of new blood vessels. And then, from a metabolic perspective, they also have a lot of metabolic activity. So, they either metabolize or activate numerous circulating factors that may or may not have vasoactive properties. So, these would include polypeptide hormones, amines, nucleotides, lipoproteins, metabolites of arachidonic acid, and reactive oxygen species. And this figure is showing that you can have an infinite number of insults. So, for example, a biomechanical insult would be high blood pressure or maybe turbulent blood flow, or you can have biochemical insults such as a microbial infection or maybe a nutritional imbalance, some toxin from the environment, or maybe LPS from our gut. So many different insults, but the finite response is just limited to three, which is inflammation, oxidative stress, and an immune response. And then these then contribute to endothelial dysfunction. These figures are just showing the same thing where you can have in one case a viral infection, in another case high blood sugar. They will both generate reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress and will reduce the availability of nitric oxide and thus contribute to endothelial dysfunction. Another figure saying the same thing, the different conditions that you encounter in metabolic syndrome, the different insults, again creating increased reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress, which can then decrease the production of endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which then contributes to decreased nitric oxide and endothelial dysfunction. Again, you all know this, kabisado nyo to more than me. It's really more for my review. So how do we use nutrition to enhance endothelial health? I'm not going to be super duper specific on endothelial health, like what nutrients do you need, because I want to talk about nutrition beyond diets. We're really used to thinking about nutrition as what to eat, but there's more to it than that. How do you process that food that you ate? And also, when you eat it is part of the equation or part of the bigger picture. We only have take 20 minutes. So this is going to be a very general overview. So we know that there are certain dietary patterns that are associated with cardiovascular health and actually health in general. The Mediterranean diet being one of the most popular and most researched diet patterns. We have the DASH diet and again the Mediterranean diet. So I picked these just to show because they were specifically looking at endothelial function in these studies. And again, I'm sure you're very familiar with the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. And then we also know what not to eat Western diet patterns, the ones with high refined carbohydrates, with a lot of sugars, inflammatory sugars, processed foods. So we know that this type of diet pattern increases our risk for cardiovascular, cardiometabolic disease, and just poor health in general. This RCT compared the Mediterranean diet with a low fat diet. And it found that the Mediterranean diet modulates endothelial function better, even in those with severe endothelial dysfunction already. This is just different dietary pattern pyramids. So again, you have the DASH diet, you have the Mediterranean diet. And the reason I'm putting this up here is just to emphasize, if you look at the basis of these pyramids, it's really emphasizing plant-based diets. So having fruits and vegetables, having whole grains. That makes sense to have more plant foods because plants contain a lot of phytochemicals and phytonutrients such as flavonoids or polyphenols or anthocyanins, many of which act as antioxidants. So reactive oxygen species cause oxidative stress, and oxidative stress can decrease nitric oxide production. And therefore, if we have antioxidants to combat those reactive oxygen species, then you have lessened oxidative stress, and the cascade that the ROS triggers is lessened. Now, I said I wanted to share more practical tips on how you can recommend or prescribe these to your patients. And you can tell them Mediterranean diet or DASH diet. It can be overwhelming for some patients that they need to look at these dietary patterns. So I like to give this guide, this simpler guide to my patients. This is from Michael Polan. He's an investigative journalist and author. This is from his book, In Defense of Food. And he summarized everything he learned from writing that book in these three phrases: eat food, mostly plants, not too much. So, eat food meaning real food. The less processed, the better. The whole food. This is gas na this past few years, diba? Whole foods, plant based. But really, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, these are the foods that contain the nutrients that our body needs to function properly. And these are the foods that contain antioxidants and actually combat inflammation versus the more processed foods, the refined foods, where the nutrients have been stripped from them and they can actually cause more inflammation. Now, mostly plants, again, I already mentioned why, but the not too much, I'll touch on this later in the last part of my talk, how caloric restriction can help improve our health. Now, the fourth point in this simplified diet guide is not too fast. Mark David authored the book called The Slow Down Diet, and this speaks to how we eat. Even if you're eating nutrient dense foods, a lot of plant foods, but you're not able to digest those foods properly, that you won't be able to absorb the nutrients from those foods. So, beyond the what of what we eat, we need to look into the how. And this is just reminding us of what we were taught in med school of how digestion goes. It starts in the mouth. A lot of us tend to take that for granted. We think we just need to swallow the food and that's it. But really, we need to take the time to break that food down mechanically in our mouth, mix it up with saliva, which is the first digestive enzyme it comes in contact with, and then go through all of the different steps of the digestive process. You can think of the gut as a factory line where if you make a mistake in the first part, it's very hard to rectify that in later parts. Pag sablay yung umpisa, mahirap habulin. So for us to be able to digest properly, we need to eat in a relaxed state or at a relaxed pace, hindi yung nagmamadali. If you're in predominantly sympathetic stimulation in fight or flight mode, in the stress response, the functioning of the digestive tract can actually shut down. So here, the peristalsis is reduced, intestinal motility is reduced. But when we're in a parasympathetic dominant state, so rest and digest mode, then the functions of the digestive tract are enhanced, or they work better. You have more digestive enzyme secretion, the motility is increased, and basically you're able to digest better and therefore absorb better. So how do we How should we eat? We should eat mindfully. Number one, you want to chew your food slowly and adequately. This article was published just this year. They looked at the relationship of BMI with chewing factors, and they found that an increase in the number of chews increases the plasma concentration of GI hormones like insulin, GLP-1, ghrelin, and CCK. And then that led to an improvement in fullness, a suppression of postprandial blood glucose, and an enhancement of digestive ability. So if you improve your ability to sense that you're full, then that will also translate into less caloric intake. A suppression of postprandial blood glucose spike, as we saw in one of those earlier figures, hyperglycemia can be one of the triggers of endothelial dysfunction. So suppressing that postprandial sugar spike is helpful. And then an enhancement of digestive ability translates into better absorption of the nutrients from the food, and your body now has the nutrients it needs to produce nitric oxide or to repair the different cells. So how do we bring this to a like practical level? The dietary pattern you can teach by using a plate method. So like one half of the plate should be plant foods, one fourth of the plate should be your complex carbs, like a whole grain like brown rice, and one fourth of your plate would be your protein source. So that's easy for patients to visualize or to picture when they're putting their meal together. And then with the chewing mindfully, you can teach them the spoon method. And with the spoon method, you want to look at what's on your spoon. You want to make sure it fits on your spoon. It's not a big mound of just rice, but the spoon method, because if you take in less food per spoonful, then that means less chews for that spoonful. But that also means you increase the number of spoonfuls that you take, and therefore you increase the total number of chews. And again, that's going to translate into more hormone secretion, a feeling of fullness, and slower rise in the blood glucose levels. So, a simple thing as chewing properly has profound effects. Eating mindfully also means we savor the flavors, we pay attention to our meal, whatever that meal is, whether it's the stereotypical, very healthy meal or even a not so healthy fast food, but you want to savor the flavors. Remember, when we're chewing and when we're mixing that food with saliva, our taste buds are perceiving that flavor and the texture, and that helps us to appreciate the food. It also helps us to select more nutritious food versus not so healthy food. And other factors with eating mindfully would be to pay attention to your environment. Make sure you're paying attention to your meal, you're not distracted, because being distracted during a meal will also make you unaware that you're already full, and you can just keep eating, and that increases the risk for excess caloric intake, which will lead to obesity. So these simple things over time, the effects add up. So we did an overview of what to eat, how to eat. Now let's talk about timing, when to eat. And I don't know if you've heard the term therapeutic fasting, but I use this with my patients. Caloric restriction, we tend to think caloric restriction is dieting, right? You lessen your calories. And yes, that's it. But nowadays, a lot of people have excess calories. They eat too much. And caloric restriction in this context can also mean just restricting your calories to the appropriate amount, like getting rid of all the excessive calories. Although the original meaning of caloric restriction is really lessening the calories that you take. So caloric restriction can be challenging to maintain long term for a lot of people, but there are other ways to do this where you can do time restricted feeding or intermittent fasting. So let's look first at some articles about caloric restriction and intermittent fasting. In this article, they looked at how it affects the mitochondria, the heart endothelial function. So both caloric restriction and intermittent fasting decreased body weight, insulin resistance, blood pressure, lipids, inflammatory status. Part of that is through the reduction of reactive oxygen species, the production of ROS. It helped to improve mitochondrial biogenesis. Specifically in the cardiovascular system, both dietary approaches help to improve endothelium dependent relaxation. So this table is just summarizing the main benefits of caloric restriction and intermittent fasting, notably in the cardiovascular parameters. It improves nitric oxide bioavailability and endothelium dependent relaxation. This other study looked at how IF affects cardiometabolic risk factors and the gut microbiota. So I know Dr. Kua is going to give a talk on the gut microbiome and hypertension. So more and more, we're seeing that the gut microbiome has a significant impact on different chronic conditions. This other study looked at the effect of fasting during Ramadan and specifically what its effect were on endothelial dysfunction. And the conclusion of the investigators was that there was an improvement in endothelial dysfunction in those patients with slow coronary flow, and they were able to show this using the TIMI frame count. So, how do you prescribe therapeutic fasting to your patients? I know there's a lot on the internet about IF or intermittent fasting, and usually this is what people mean or what people are doing when they say IF. Intermittent fasting is the bigger umbrella term. There are many different patterns of how to intermittently fast. One of the most common, most well known is this actually, it's better termed as time restricted feeding or TRF. You have a fasting and an eating window. The most typical pattern would be 16-8, where you fast for 16 hours and then you have an eating window of 8 hours, or 14-10. But the range can be you can start from just 12 hours fasting, 12 hours eating window, and then you can go as much as, and I have some patients who do this, 20 hours fasting and 4-hour eating window. So I find with my patients, this works better for those who don't have families yet. So are either single or married without kids because they don't need to take into consideration, family mealtime. It also makes it easier. I find I have a lot of patients who say this is easier for them because then, if they're not going to take breakfast or let's say dinner, then that's one less thing that they need to attend to, and it gives them more time for other things, for example, for exercise. Typically, you'd want to do this on a daily basis, although you could also do it for just a few days out of the week, whatever suits you. I have some patients who start it one day a week just to see if they can survive that long of a fasting period. And then eventually they'll start doing it every day. Also, if you're going to start them on time restricted feeding, as with any intermittent fasting, you want to first ease them into it by having them stop snacking. You want to get their bodies used to have being in fasted state. Now, intermittent fasting is the umbrella term. And when we say fasting, doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to eat anything for that day. You could take between 25 to 40% of your usual intake. Or another way to look at it is you would reduce your intake by about 60 to 75% of your usual. And then you can do that in different patterns, such as a 5-2 diet, which means for 5 days a week, you're eating as usual. And then on 2 days of the week, you reduce your intake accordingly. You could also do an alternate day fast where day one, you eat as usual. Day two, you reduce your intake. Day three, you eat as usual, and you just keep alternating that. The one that I like to prescribe to patients the most is a 24-hour fast. And I find for patients with family or if they're in a household, This is the easier one to implement. So a 24-hour fast, you just need to choose a fasting day. For example, you choose Friday as your fasting day. You'd have dinner on Thursday, skip breakfast and lunch on Friday, and then have dinner on Friday. So that's 24 hours fasting. I find this works better for those who live in family households because they don't need to skip. Typically, dinner is the family meal. And so they can still have dinner with their family. Also, because it's just one day a week, instead of having to pay attention to it every day, it's easier because it's just one day a week. You set that day and you can recruit your family to help you out on that day. Some patients are afraid to become hungry, hungry and angry when they do this. But when they finally get into it, they're very surprised to discover that the hunger actually becomes more manageable and even fades as they get used to it. So I've had some patients who will either level up to 36 hours fasting, meaning there's just one day where they don't eat anything at all. They just have water. Some have black coffee, some will have black tea, but nothing with any calories in it. And then some patients will increase the frequency of the 24-hour fast, where they'll have, let's say, twice a week do the 24-hour fast. So these are the different patterns that you can recommend to your patient so that they can take advantage of the benefits of therapeutic fasting. And I want to emphasize that the concept of therapeutic fasting and then diet, meaning what you're eating and how you're eating it, are different. You can do the therapeutic fasting regardless of what diet you are following, whether you're following a Mediterranean diet, DASH diet, paleo, vegan, keto, carnivore diet, junk food diet, whatever diet, you can incorporate therapeutic fasting into that because therapeutic fasting is looking at the amount of time that you're not eating. And so, as a recap, I wanted to share that there's more to nutrition beyond just the concept of diet and what not to eat. So, what to eat, how to eat, and when to eat. And I hope I was able to give you practical tips that you can share with your patients to help them improve their nutrition and enhance not just their endothelial health, but also their overall health. So, thank you for your time and attention.